I can't stop talking about Mustafa's new album, Dunya. It's like a really special debut record that's given us a lot to think about. Mustafa is this fascinating artist who's fusing a lot of genres in a way I don't think we've seen before. So today on the podcast, Mustafa's rise and what it represents. I'm Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. This is Commotion. A couple weeks ago, acclaimed Toronto poet and musician Mustafa released his debut album. It's called Dunya, and I just want to tell you that this album is an album that is like really worth sitting with. It's an album that has brought me to a really reflective place. I want you to take a listen to this.
And when you left me waiting, I thought, did you do it in the name of God?
So this is the debut single from that record. It's called Name of God off Dunya. It's this highly anticipated debut album from Mustafa. Huda Hassan, Matt Amha, and Rania Al-Mujambar had a lot to say about this record and also about Mustafa's musical journey up until this point. They joined me to unpack all of it. Here's our conversation. Welcome to Commotion. How's everybody feeling?
Really good, thanks for having us.
First of all, let me just say, I think this is the first all East African panel that we've had, and I love that for us. I think like I'm going to tell all my Ghanaian friends, no space for you on this show, but not today. You're all here because you have a deeply personal relationship with Mustafa's music, Mustafa's rise. You have an interesting vantage point, and we're going to get into all of that because you're not just critics who are dissecting the music from a distance. There's some sort of relationship here. Matt, I'm going to start with you. What is your connection to Mustafa, his music, this album, and how we got to this moment?
So I think the primary connection for me is that we are from neighborhoods in Toronto that are located essentially just adjacent to one another. So, essentially we grew up in similar environments, under similar conditions, and around many of the same people. And so like a lot of the stories that he details in his work, specifically those around loss and violence, are about young men in some cases that I knew as well. And so, I have close friends of mine who are no longer here that were immortalized in his music videos, for example. That's kind of the extent of my relationship to this music.
Huda, what about you? What's your relationship?
My relationship with Mustafa was professional and then became personal. I actually was on his first management team. I left his team a decade ago. So I met Mustafa when he was a teenager, when he was a poet, when he was still feeling complications about whether or not to make music as a Muslim. And unfortunately, I ended up leaving his team because of my own grief that I endured about 10 years ago that redirected my own life.
And Rania, I'll give you the last but not least here. What's your connection to Mustafa and his music?
Yeah, my connection to Mustafa is as someone who has lived and worked in and around Regent Park for quite some time. Seeing Mustafa around the neighborhood, first as a poet, then as a music maker and a multidisciplinary artist. He's someone I've seen, walking back from Friday Jummah prayers, stopping in different places in the neighborhood, saying hello to people. And I think his music to me connects me to an experience in Toronto that a lot of people know, but that isn't always spoken about, a collective kind of grief. I think he's doing some interesting witnessing that's complex and difficult, and I'm looking forward to getting into it.
Ooh, I love that frame. I love that frame of a conversation, the idea of interesting witnessing, because that's what I want to talk about today. But two things I think would be useful to maybe contextualize for people who might have heard of him when the full name was Mustafa the Poet, because that was, for a period of time, that was his artist name, was Mustafa the Poet. We have so much ground to cover in this conversation. Why don't we start with this?
And God is calling. It's been years since you've been back. You can keep what's in your hands. And God is calling. Every time I say your name, there's a wall that's in the way.
That is Gaza's Calling off Dunya, the debut album from Mustafa. Rania Mustafa is Sudanese, and so are you, and so am I, which is why we don't say things like Sudanese, we say things like Sudani on the show. But where do you hear Sudan showing up on this album?
Yeah, I mean, as a Sudani person, so much of the imagery and the sound in the album feels really familiar to me.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, I think for a lot of people, they'll hear the instrumentals and they'll hear something that sounds distinctly Eastern, which I think is a huge part of the traditional Sudanese folk music repertoire. But also, I think in the vocal style, Mustafa has a distinct vocal style for a lot of people here. This sort of like haunting vocals, a lot of air in the voice. And I think Sudanese music is very much uses those things. And in particular, a lot of contemporary Sudanese artists like Rasha Sheikh ad-Din, who for me have that haunting quality in their voice, also are using these kinds of instrumentals that, show that they are making music with one foot on either side of the atlas. And I think that's been really coming through in Mustafa's music, but also in the visuals. We've seen a lot of that in this album in particular. The living rooms that look like, my Haboba's living room in Khartoum, that the dancing that I've, seen in every kind of gathering for a long time, but also drawing from Madih, or the sort of praise music tradition, where you hear those punctuated hand drums, like very soft percussion. So for me, like, it feels very familiar to my ear, even if the subject matter is distinct from a lot of traditional Sudanese music.
Okay, I'm so glad that you brought up the idea of Madih, because that's kind of what I hear all throughout his music. And Madih is sort of the equivalent of gospel, but for Sudanese people, just in terms of making music that is specifically rooted in praise of God. I just want to play a bit of "I'll Go Anywhere." Can we just hear a little bit of that song?
Stay up through the morning, I'll be on my knees.
That might have been a 15-second clip, Matt, but I think if you meet a Sudani person, they can give you a thesis just on that 15-second stretch, because you heard the hand clapping that Ronnie was talking about there, and then you just hear this kind of sampled, a little bit ghostly sampled, sort of way of singing a big kind of Sudani chorus. Maybe, Matt, you want to talk a little bit about the textures and the sound that you hear from this, because I think they're quite different and they build on what we heard from his EP When Smoke Rises, which was from 2021.
Yeah, I think it is a little bit of a departure in some ways. I think both musically but narrative-wise as well. I think the debut record in some ways struck me as like a Toronto survivor's remorse record, and was really familiar in a certain kind of way. It was rooted in very, 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 very specific stories of loss and death that people from our part of the city will be really familiar with. Writing about kind of ongoing loss in that way is very, very precarious, and, lots of people, these are ongoing events, and people have kind of, really complicated feelings about that, I think. But I think that this record was struck me at least as a return home, and in a way that also felt familiar, like the kind of pilgrimage back to the place that your parents fled, that we kind of first generation East Africans will recognize, I think, from our own lives.
Yeah.
I'm not Sudanese, but I'm from a part of northern Ethiopia called Tigray. It's a few hundred kilometers east of Sudan. And even for me, there are kind of sonic regional elements that feel familiar to me as well. So yeah, it definitely came across in my listening to the project too.
Huda, let me ask you, as you listened to Dunya, what came to mind for you?
I think a lot of it's the same things as Matt and Rania. For me, I hear the title of the album, right? Dunya meaning world. And I think we get an exposure to Mustafa's own world, or the inner makings of his world. We hear instruments. At least for me, I'm hearing instruments central to Sudan, but also the Black Muslim diaspora, like the oud, and citations of burial songs as well too. And some of my favorite parts have to do with even hearing folks from his upbringing and neighborhood. Like, you hear splashes of puffy yells all over the album. And some of those citations are songs that have come out in previous albums from those individual artists as well too. But I think what mostly is happening for me is also this recognition of the way in which Mustafa is playing with folk music, or utilizing folk music, which, if we want to really unpack it, arrived to this continent through the forced migration of Black diasporas, right? So, which is something I love to teach my students whenever we're talking about media and music. But I think Mustafa's kind of compelling us to think about the African indigeneity of folk music in his own particular and unique way.
I think that's a really good point to bring up because, Matt, as we sort of talk about this album, there's a temptation, particularly with the instrumentation, to try to figure out where to classify this as, like, in terms of just like a genre pigeonhole. And this album sort of like plays a bunch with a bunch of different genre conventions. So it doesn't quite fit into folk, but it doesn't also quite fit into hip hop, even though it uses a lot of like some of the hip hop conventions. You hear some of like the hip hop instrumentation, hip hop drum machines in there. What do you make of the way that we've been having, the conversation we've been having about where to classify this album?
Yeah, like I think, these kinds of classifications have always been fraught with politics, I think.
Yeah.
Like it's obviously, it is Mustafa's responsibility to self-identify his sound however he chooses. And I think that he's been able to do exactly that. But I think the response of the public sometimes is kind of interesting. And I think, like these are market trends that are much bigger than Mustafa in really every way. But I think there is a way in which labels and some of these industries will try to present certain kinds of Black art as like a safer alternative to other artists that may otherwise look like them and come from similar conditions. And I think that sometimes, like when we're talking about, is it folk, is it rap, is it hip hop? Like we're kind of talking around this like bigger sociological conversation that's going on. I think to his credit, like Mustafa clearly sees himself as somebody that is part of the kind of folk tradition. And he said as much before. But I think that he also comes from a traditionally hip hop environment. And I think that this is something that his team clearly plays with a lot. Like the juxtaposition in a lot of his music videos, for example, often features, images of life in Regent or in Toronto community housing set against like a Joni Mitchell or Leonard Cohen instrumental, and like, I think like the visual language of that juxtaposition is something that different kinds of audiences will respond to in different ways.
I should even say, Rania, like it's the image of Mustafa himself. I mean, sort of like when you see him in public, he is a folk singer who's wearing a bulletproof vest, and he's trying to do both things. He's sort of trying to embody all the visual signifiers of all those worlds. What do you make of the conversation about how we try to sort of pigeonhole him into a genre, even though he kind of seems to resist that in interesting ways?
I think it's really important to remember that there's a particular kind of sound that is associated with Toronto hoods that is such a small sliver of the kinds of like the sonic landscapes of these places, right? And so often we, particularly for an artist that began as young as Mustafa did, I think you have to figure out who you are, your sound, your identity, how you relate to your neighborhood, all the tensions that you hold in that in front of a lot of people, right? And in a really often ungenerous and unkind environment, while you're also simultaneously navigating so much of life's grief. I think it's really important for artists, particularly, and we see this with a lot of artists who are white or from the dominant culture in whatever way, who get to like reinvent their sound throughout the arc of their career in so many different ways, and are not, sequestered into some definition that feels like it's suffocating or not allowing them their full artistic expression. I think it's important to remember that, sometimes on Oak Street in Regent Park and sometimes on Bleecker Street in St. Jamestown, there are, Black girls like me who love country music. I love every sad song, right? Whatever it looks like, whatever genre.
Yeah.
And that for so many of us, like that kind of folk sound, even though some people might associate it with a certain kind of Eurocentric music tradition here, as, Huda reminded us right at the beginning of this is, an African indigenous music tradition. And particularly for someone like Mustafa, it's not so far removed from likely the musical traditions that he was steeped in growing up, right? So I think it's important for us to create space for young artists to be able to figure out what that sound is and to be open to like the ways that people, change their artistic practice. And even if they build their career on a particular sound, as artists, I think we abandon so many practices that used to be a part of our identity, but are not anymore.
Go ahead, Huda. Go ahead.
just had to quickly insert, and I feel like both, my peers are identifying this. Black people historically have been, historically and continue to be trapped by the categorization of genre, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I immediately think about Nina Simone admitting in her later years that she was depressed because she was trained as a classical pianist, meaning she was meant to be in the classical world, but she was forced into the genre of jazz, which is so common for a lot of 20th century artists.
I love that we're all the types of people who could never hear a country song without reminding people, be like, hey, just by the way, real quick before you go, country music is Black music. Have a great day. This is it. This is the kind of collection that we have among us, and I love this for us. Okay, I just want to take a pause, and we'll be back in just a moment. Okay, we are back, and today on Commotion, we are talking about Mustafa's new album, Dunya. I love this album so much. Okay, let's hear another cut from this album.
Construction outside, woke us up about 15 times. You took the gun and shot it at the sky to trade this bullet for a new life. Bullet like a new crowd. Let's go inside, I wanna see you in a dim light. I think I wanna be a good guy, but good guys die first.
This is Commotion. My name is Alamin Abdul Mahmoud, and that is a bit of the song called SNL. It's off Dunya, which is the debut album from Mustafa. Matt Amha is here, Huda Hassan is here, and Rania Al-Mujammar is here, and we're talking about this record. And Rania, I want to ask you about spirituality and religion and the way that they show up, because they seem to be consistent themes in Mustafa's music. I was at like the little launch event that they had for this record, and Daniel Caesar was interviewing him, and Daniel Caesar sort of made this remark of saying, I actually don't think I've ever heard you write a romantic love song. Most of your love songs seem to be about God. And Mustafa was like, yeah, I think like that's sort of accurate. How do you feel about the way that these themes show up on this record?
I think I want to start by saying that I think Mustafa has been very thoughtful and principled in ways that are public, and I'm sure in ways that we will never come to know, right?
Sure.
Privately, as most people of faith have to kind of negotiate these things. I think it's important for a lot of Muslim artists from different schools of thought and like different like intersections of culture in Islam to be able to take up their faith in their practice. I think inherently in the Western world to do that is to take a certain kind of risk, because there's a particular demonization of Muslims, particularly at this moment, right? And like the kinds of political choices that Mustafa's making parallel to the album itself, I think that's part of the context and it matters a lot. I think it's full of contrasts, language, imagery that feels probably really familiar to a lot of Muslims in some ways. And I think it's, for some people, evoked something really like nostalgic or really comforting. But I think for other people, it's been like a spark point for criticism and contention. I think if you're a Muslim person, particularly if you take up Islam in your work, you don't even have to. You could just have a quote unquote Muslim name, right? As silly as that language is, right? And you're expected to answer for, negotiate, speak to, justify, explain, so on and so forth. And there's always a question as to whether you can claim your faith in that way. I think, Mustafa's taking that up in ways that feel complicated and that also feel really important. I think Mustafa's been deliberate about talking about faith with people. I think more generous than I would have been in terms of like explaining like his justifications, his rationale, his study, and like why he's come to the conclusions that he's come to. I think that feels really important to put as part of the context. But to me, I think it's the ordinary ways that particularly Sudanese people take up God in everyday conversations, right? And it's so baked into the way that we speak to each other, that we express ourselves, that to me feels like very natural. And that any Muslim person in any place in their like faith journey has the right, and I would argue the responsibility, to take that up in some way in the work that they do and how they move through the world. In general, I'm enjoying it. I'm curious to see where it goes. I'm enjoying all the contrast and like the imagery, specifically for the visuals in the album, which I'm finding to be, very familiar, very Regent Park, very Toronto in so many ways, and a particular kind of Black Muslim experience in Toronto that I think a lot of people are resonating with.
I love that answer because it reminds me of like so many of the conversations I've been having with my own mom, you know, about like the way that religion shows up in her life. And she's made different choices now that she wouldn't have made, 10, 15 years ago. And so just a perceptible shift in being like, religion shows up in this way. She has a different relationship to music now than she did 15 years ago, for example. And it's a part of the conversation that I've always kind of been a little uncomfortable with, and I don't know what to do with it. And so it felt comforting to me, even though I would say I disagree with some of the perspectives that Mustafa has kind of put forward in this album. It felt comfortable to me because it's exactly the thing that you said, Rania. Like this is just kind of part and parcel of the everyday conversation. We're kind of always navigating what it means to have a relationship with God, or what is that relationship. Huda, what about you? How did you feel about the way that religion and spirituality sort of showed up on this record?
I mean, I guess for me, it's there's a beauty to it, especially knowing that Mustafa has historically had a problem, actually, his own internal tensions about making music that has to do with his spirituality. When I left his team 10 years ago, that's where we kind of left conversations. He didn't know if it was halal or permissible if you were Muslim, and it's not just our faith system. Other faith systems have this debate as well, too.
Yeah.
He didn't know if it was permissible to make music. And I think that we're kind of seeing him reconcile with his own answer to that. So I wrote a profile on him a couple of years ago when his EP came out for ID magazine. And I was actually very intentional about talking about that, about mentioning the fact that Mustafa did take a long break from making music. He did actually insert his own gaps into his own career to study and learn the different Islamic schools of thought about whether or not he could make music and if it would still be halal. And I think on this album, it seems like he's firmly rooted in his answer and in his art being inspired by spirituality and religion. And you hear it in I'll Go Anywhere. The first time I heard that song, I love that you gave the context of Daniel Caesar asking the question in Toronto, because I didn't get a chance to see that.
Yeah.
But that's what I've been thinking this entire time going through this album. Are these love songs, or are these songs about God, which I think for anybody who has a relationship to spirituality, it's so special. But in the song, you hear him calling upon a love for a higher being and calling upon guidance. But you also hear him working through the difficulties of faith too. You hear him announcing, I don't know if I'm losing you. I don't know if this connection is as strong as I assume to be. I think he's just being so honest in his work in a way that I really appreciate. But the irony for me is that his choice to boldly claim Islam or boldly claim his religion through his work has actually led to critique, not just from outside or other communities, but actually within his own community. It's a lot of Muslims, it's a lot of my own diaspora, to BH, critiquing Mustafa and that choice. I have to call our people out.
No, I'm glad that you did, because like it's something that so many people might listen to this album and not understand just like how fraught even just some of those choices are, and like, look, the album's been out for 8 days at this point, and I swear to God, I'll Go Anywhere was my number one most played song of September, even though like September, it was like 3 days within September, but I just kept on playing that song over and over again because there is something that feels really honest about the confrontation that is happening in that song, that feels like I just want to witness it. You just want to sort of be around it. There's a couple of words that keep coming out through our discussion, Matt, that I really like: the idea of witnessing, but also the idea of being rooted. This album is in conversation with something, is in conversation with something that feels kind of substantial. You may not like where it lands. You may not like, the conclusion that he comes to, but you can't say that he's not talking about something very specific. And I should say, like, his art is also intimately rooted in the youth politics of Regent Park, as you sort of mentioned. This is a Toronto community that has gone through a lot of heartbreak, a lot of loss, a lot of trauma, but also a lot of surveillance. You're right. A lot of media attention, a lot of police attention. When you sort of think about this record and think about the work that Mustafa's trying to do and his laser focus on his neighborhood, this idea of rootedness, do you think that's created a different set of issues for him as a spokesperson, quote unquote, or at least like as a very visible representation of these conversations?
Yeah. And like That's a deeply complicated question. And like, there are things that I can say and there are things that I cannot. I think that like being a young Black artist from this city, from a neighborhood like Regent, like to put it plainly, is dangerous. And like from the moment that you become a public person, and by virtue of his poetry, Mustafa has been one for most of his life, you immediately become implicated in all kinds of street politics, which can be compromising. Like I can count on two hands the high profile artists who come from neighborhoods like his that have been killed or hurt, in the last 5 years or so. And like, this is something that Mustafa is clearly aware of and something that he's talked about before. There's a song on the album called Leaving Toronto, which kind of talks a little bit about it as well. Like,
yes.
Toronto is not safe for him. And had he been from Oakville or Mississauga, this isn't likely to have been the case. Right. And like, Toronto is a city for me that often eats its young, it eats its best. And all of us on this call are likely to have lost people to these conditions, but Mustafa managed to get out. And so these songs on both albums for me are dispatches from the other side, from somebody who survived, who went on to experience young adulthood, who went on to experience more of the possibility of life. But the like precarity and all of that is not lost on me. And it is all so deeply rooted in Toronto, but as you say, very specifically in the experience and condition of Regent Park.
Let's add precarity to that list of words that started to keep popping up, because I think there is something delicate about the balance of what Mustafa's trying to do with this record. Rania, it's like should not be lost on anyone listening that Mustafa's own brother, Muhammad Ahmed, was shot and killed last year in Regent Park. When you hear this album, Rania, what do you make of the precarious lines that Mustafa's trying to navigate through this record?
Yeah, I mean, I first want to, send my prayers to so many people who will be listening to this, who are grieving Muhammad, right? And pray for mercy on his soul. And it's something that Mustafa has asked for from a community repeatedly, that, when you listen to this album, when you think of me, pray for my brother, right? And so I'm holding on to that, because as much as I think we think that artists owe a particular ethic of care as they negotiate some of these things, I also think we owe Mustafa that ethic of care back, in terms of really recognizing this is someone who has experienced a before and after grief. I agree with Matt in some ways that this is somebody who's writing from the other side. But at some point, with everything that this side took from you, does it feel like you really survived, right? I think about that a lot. And I think about this is, if losing a sibling is a before and after kind of experience, there is a part of you that cannot continue to exist once you experience like that kind of profound loss. I think a lot of the time for all artists who are writing from a deeply personal place, but in particular for artists who are saddled with a certain kind of edification, a certain kind of tokenization, and a certain kind of like extraction of their life experience in so many ways, particularly artists who Mustafa's been writing as a poet for so long, like in ways that feel like I'm so stunned when I think about or see like older pictures of him that like, this is a child. This is my child's age, actually.
Yes.
So while I'm reckoning with that, I'm also recognizing that, he's got a huge responsibility of negotiating where does your story end and somebody else's story begins, right? And if not writing about your own grief, what is yours to tell? And if not here, where do you put it down, right? And I think it's important to remember that sometimes we say that artists from communities like this have a greater responsibility because we're being criminalized and surveilled as a result of some of the very public telling that they do. But I also want to remind us that the criminalization and the surveillance comes the grief and the response to it, not the other way around, right? Is whether or not there are people in our communities who are telling these stories in whatever platform, the same apparatuses that harm, police, and surveil and criminalize us will continue to do so regardless. And so I want to recognize the relationship between those conditions. And I just think that, it's a place to put it all down one way or another. And there's a catharsis in it for so many people who, either on this album or on the EP will hear names like Ali, and that will not be abstract to them. It'll be like a young man who was in my arts programming. It won't be somebody I don't know, right? And it feels important that that exists there in that way, as a contrast to the known to the police news articles that came out in the aftermath of his murder, right? So when we look at these things, I think it's important to hold those complexities. I think all of us have a right, particularly people who share in Mustafa's many sites of grief, right? In very direct ways. They have a right to feel some type of way about it. Right? And I think we could do that with a lot of care for each other.
I was going to say maybe just one thing before we go to the last question, which is that I hear a lot of that care. I hear a lot of that tenderness, and also a lot of that curiosity, and a lot of that willingness to say, "Hey, what about us?" In this conversation, or like the idea of like Mustafa's kind of given us this text, and then all of this is sort of baked into the reaction of it. I hear that from the three of you. Matt, we are in this moment where the global success of people like Drake, people like The Weeknd, people like Daniel Caesar, I think they've given a certain story about Toronto. They've certainly made the world more curious about like what is happening in Toronto. How do you get this art coming out of the city? When you think about this album, what do you think Mustafa is teaching the world about Toronto?
I think the version of Toronto that Mustafa is like rendering for his audiences is completely different to that of the myth of Drake, the world building of The Weeknd, or Daniel Caesar, who isn't even from the city, and I think that
the giggles that are going on as you said all of that, it's fantastic. Go on.
It's
go
like,
off.
It's like his depiction for me strikes me as most honest, because he comes from the kind of environment that so many others are trying to replicate, right? Like the inner city experience, the diaspora experience, the experience of over policing, all of it, and so his world, yes, is steeped in melancholy and sentimentalism and nostalgia and grief and Joni Mitchell instrumentals. But I think in the end, he's providing a pretty singular survey of life in the city when compared to his other kind of mainstream peers.
Huda, what about you? When you think about what Mustafa is trying to tell the world about Toronto, the version of Toronto that Mustafa is presenting, what comes to mind?
I mean, I love what Matt just said, because absolutely. I think about The Weeknd, and I think about a way that he had to play into anonymity, kind of hiding who he was to sell himself to the world. Drake, as we know, fabricating where he's from, one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Toronto. Let's talk about that. But Mustafa, aside from Kanon, is one of the only other Black Muslim artists I've seen to garner some global recognition for his work, which I think just shows the versatility and complexity and multiplicity of Toronto's diasporas and Black diasporas. But like Matt was saying, Mustafa's being honest with who he is through this process. He's being honest about his spiritual system. He is claiming his faith despite us living in an Islamophobic world and during an Islamophobic time. He's claiming his spirituality, and he's claiming his geographical roots from Regent Park to Sudan. So I think Mustafa is something actually quite refreshing, and really shows the many expressions that our city has to offer.
I think there is a level of mining yourself and mining your city and mining your story, and actually arriving at saying, here's something that feels like I've baked all those things into it, and that's what shows up on this record for me. Rania, you get the last word on this. What is the story of Toronto that Mustafa is telling on this album?
I think he's showing a Toronto that's the only Toronto some of us have ever known. That to me, Drake's Toronto is, I don't know, man, I'm not allowed in. I'm not on the list. I don't have the funds to access that, right? Like it's not a part of my experience. It's not real to me. It's not a part of my world.
Yeah.
But the experiences, the images, the stories, the very narrative-based songwriting style that Mustafa has is, to me, holding on to a Toronto that is fast disappearing in so many ways. It's archiving Toronto that is like literally like Regent Park, right? Yeah. I got in a cab the other day, and like the taxi driver dropped me off, and he said, "Oh yeah, Regent Park, I know that. That's a really nice neighborhood," which is in a contrast to 20 years ago, where if I got in a cab, it would drop me off on Ontario Street and I'd have to walk the rest of the way, right? So really recognizing that there's a particular kind of memorialization that's happening in the music, and a part of mourning and grief that is more than just people, that are places that are the city is very hostile to and pushing out, and people that are being pushed out. So to me, it's a piece of a complex tapestry of Toronto sound that is we're really lucky to have, and it's a part of an archive that I think is important for Black experience and Black Muslim experience in the city.
Can I just say, Rania, Huda, Matt, like this has been a dream conversation about an album that I genuinely can't stop talking about, and this is the best conversation. I just needed this so much. So thank you to all of you for being here. This has been tremendous. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I'm standing here by your workplace, hoping that you're there. Wearing the things you said on my face, like they're a prayer.
That is a bit of Iman by Mustafa. It is off his debut album, Dunya, which is out right now. Just an album, again, I cannot stop revisiting. Before that, you heard my conversation with Rania Al-Mujammar, who's a Sudanese artist and organizer based in Toronto, Huda Hassan, a writer and culture critic based in New York City, and Matt Amha, a writer and culture critic from Toronto. That is it for the show today. My name is Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. You should listen to Dunya by Mustafa. It's an incredible album. Have a great day.